Hello, I'm Olena Palko, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Eastern Europe's Minorities in a Century of Change, a podcast on the history of minority experiences in Central and Eastern Europe during the 20th century. This series is part of the Institute of Historical Research Centennial Commemoration, Our Century, Looking Back, Thinking Forward, and has been organized by the BASIS Study Group for Minority History. It was made possible through the help and support of the British Association of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. The study group is a forum devoted to researching minorities in the national and regional histories of Central, Eastern, and Southeast Europe and promoting closer scholarly collaborations. For more information, please visit our website at studygroupforminorityhistory.com. On this episode, Michal Frankl at Masaryk Institute at the Czech Academy of Sciences speaks to Matthew Frank at University of Leeds about the history of international population transfers, migration, and refugees in Eastern Europe.
Thank you, Olena, for this introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you, albeit only virtually today, especially because the topic for today connects very nicely to my research project called The Unlikely Refuge, with a question mark. It's an European Research Council funded project which tries to look anew at the history of refugees in Central and Eastern Europe and tries to examine this space as a place where refugees not only left, but where they also searched for protection. And we could hardly have a better guest for speaking about refugees, migration, and population transfer than Matthew Frank, the University of Leeds. I think much of our discussion today will be centered around his recent book, Making Minorities History. However, before we do that, Matthew, welcome to the podcast. And it would be great if you could start by telling us a little bit about how you got towards researching the rather darker stories of European history of the 20th century.
Thanks, Michal, and thanks, Elena, as well. And I'm delighted to take part in this podcast, and thanks for inviting me. So to say a little bit about how I came to focus on 20th century population transfers in Europe. So I'm originally from London, which is where I did my my undergraduate studies at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, SEAS, in the early 1990s, which is also where and when, I suppose, with hindsight, I developed an interest in this topic. That was a time, of course, of profound change in what we still unquestioningly and unreflectively called Eastern Europe, and the darker side of which, of course, were the tragic developments in what was Yugoslavia at that time. And I was fortunate enough at SEAS to have the opportunity to study these contemporary international developments in the region alongside its history. And then after spells living and working in Russia and Germany, I returned to the UK for postgraduate studies at St Anthony's College, Oxford, to work on the expulsion of the Germans from East Central Europe at the end of the Second World War, a subject that had received and was once again receiving a lot of attention in Germany at the time, in the 90s, but much less so in the Anglosphere, though this was already beginning to change. And my focus in my postgraduate studies was on the international dimensions of this topic, drawing primarily on a wide range of British sources. And in that project, my aim was to show why the British came to regard the forcible removal of German minorities as a necessity, and also to explain how and why the British public and officials responded as they did once mass expulsion became a reality in 1945. And at the heart of the study and its explanation of British actions was this concept of population transfer. Yeah, this idea that a minority could and should, in the interests of international peace and on the basis of an interstate treaty, could be removed from its country of residence and resettled in its ethnic homeland. And what I wanted to show, and what I did show in that project, was that while most British observers accepted the principle of population transfer, most were consistently uneasy with the results of putting this into practice. And Expelling the Germans, which was the book that resulted from this research, was basically about this clash of principle and practice over population transfer. So in a sense, it was a natural progression then, after that, to move on to the study of a concept of population transfer in its wider European dimensions, as a kind of multi-archival international history, in order to connect the different contexts and episodes in which it was invoked and applied over the course of the 20th century. And Making Minorities History, which is my second book, was the result of these endeavors over a decade in different archives in Europe and on the other side of the Atlantic.
And there is a very broad, wonderful research looking just at the bibliography and the list of archives that you have looked there for your book. And Matthew, by the way, I need to think about how my research also originates in the spirit of the 1990s. And I've done a lot of reflection on that lately. But let's move onwards towards the book and its arguments. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more detail about what are these population transfers, what are the concepts behind them, and how do they actually are differentiated from other cases of mass displacement?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an important question, and something that needs to be outlined. Okay, so yes, the distinction is crucial, and it's one that proponents of population transfer were at pains to point out. Yeah, especially in the face of kind of criticisms of this measure, that it was somehow barbaric or impractical. And for those who invoked population transfer as a solution to minorities' problems, it did come to denote a separate, if not always clearly defined process, one which was distinguishable from kind of other coerced movements of population in two ways. Because of its intended outcomes, so the idea of that it would reduce international tension, that it could avoid massacre of groups if otherwise left in situ, the consolidation of the nation state, which is something I think you also wanted to talk about as well later on, but not just outcomes, but also methods. That was key as well. The way in which it was done through an interstate treaty, i.e. under, with a kind of legal framework involving international cooperation between two or more states, with organizational frameworks for the resettlement of populations, so-called mixed commissions, that would oversee the movement of populations, and crucially, at least in theory, the indemnification of property, i.e. compensation for property lost of those who were transferred. And to a great extent, the terminology that's applied reflected this conceptual distinctiveness. Ideas of transfer, transference, transplant, transplantation, all of them kind of seemingly value-free words which imply a thought process, based upon a notion of this being a rational transaction, free of conflict, clean and bloodless. Now, of course, I probably don't need to point out that it looked a lot different in practice, but that is very much the concept of it that makes this idea, which, under any other circumstances would seem to be deeply illiberal, to be permissible, once it's thought of in those terms.
And reading your book, there's this process of what I found very fascinating is this process of normalization of the concept of population transfer, something which was inconceivable, then it was considered possible, and finally it was normalized. I was wondering, could you perhaps add some? I also felt that there continued to be a certain unease, that those who were involved understood that this is a risky, very complex endeavor. And I was wondering if you would like to add some examples of how the actors in these population transfers themselves came to terms with the population transfer.
Do you mean those who were involved in, to put it crudely, selling the idea and
for instance,
propagating?
be it diplomats or be it, for instance, humanitarians who were involved. I understand this was not always an easy process.
Okay, there's a question here of where it's done. Yeah, so question of where it's permissible, and certain parts of Europe that it's permissible and other parts that it isn't. When it's done, and who it's done by. I think initially, at least, within the context of the Near East, or the Aegean littoral in late 22-23, which results, the Greek refugee crisis of late 22, following the collapse of Greek expansionist advances into Anatolia, the collapse of the Greek military and the flight of large numbers of Greeks. The thinking there was that population exchange, or the compulsory exchange of population, though really it was primarily a forced transfer of Muslims from Greek to make way for Orthodox Christians from Anatolia. It was seen as the best of a host of bad options that were there. Yeah. And it was better than the alternative, which was extermination. So this is a point that that's worth making here. That often, and this is something that when we talked about areas that we might discuss today, this relationship between minority protection, and population transfer. To some extent, you can see population transfer as a form of a way of protecting minorities, particularly when, if they are left where they are, they're facing, or the prospect of facing, extermination, or deportation to an uncertain fate. So in that sense, population transfer in that context can be framed as a humanitarian protective measure, because by removing them, you are taking them to a place of safety, and avoiding a worse fate. And in that sense, it can be therefore presented as a positive measure, at least in contrast to the alternatives.
And in this sense, I think it also feeds in the current and recent discussions about humanitarianism and its entanglements with global politics, with colonialism and post-colonial situations, and just complicating the history of humanitarians who are no longer just heroes who provide aid to those who are needy. And I was fascinated by your description of how Nansen, who figures prominently in every history of humanitarianism and every history of refugee protection, how he was involved in the negotiations of the first population transfers, but also how he was brought in a very difficult position. So perhaps it would be interesting to connect this to current studies about humanitarianism.
Yeah, it would. And I don't know. I mean, if you have, I don't know whether we have a figure, as prominent, given how crowded the humanitarian landscape is today compared to the early 1920s, and how developed that's become on so many different levels. Whether there is a figure who would have had that prominence at the time, or at least, I mean, the danger with someone like Nansen is the extent to which that is a result of the kind of narratives that spun up around him afterwards, in terms of his prominence and how instrumental he was. And he's a very important part of the story that is then told about what's done in the Near East, and then the story that the League tells, of its early exploits and its successes. But at the time, Nansen's contribution to outcomes in the Near East in late 22-23 were rather minimal, actually. He was useful on a number of different levels for starting to maybe getting things moving in terms of discussions on a specific issue and concentrating minds on it. But this idea that he as a lot of the hagiography around his, humanitarian refugee work single-handedly, like some Norwegian Hercules, held up the burden of, the suffering of the Greek refugees and the other dispossessed of Europe, is a stuff of, interwar hero fantasies, and doesn't necessarily reflect the realities of the type of political work that was being done there. But what it does show, and I think absolutely, Michal, you put your finger on it there, and it'd be interesting actually in your own work, and particularly contemporaneously as well, looking at this intersection of politics and humanitarianism. Just a reminder that these are not binaries. Politics and humanitarian coexist. They are of the same. And we need to see them as being interconnected and entangled. And Nansen's a very early example of that.
And I would say that what connects them is also some the need to categorize and organize populations. Something that has been very critically explored for refugee protection, say in Africa, be it UNHCR, be it NGOs, and that is very similar to what was the very basis of the population transfers. You needed to get grasp, you needed to see the population in the sense of seeing like state, develop your categories and develop the methods to sort people into groups. And this is a very similar kind of expertise that is being, and very similar type of experts, I would guess, who are required for this kind of activity.
Yes, do you want me to come? But I entirely agree with you, and I think what's instructive about the case, the Greco-Turkish case, and the Lausanne Conventions and the categories under which those populations are identified and then ultimately moved, is those of largely very crude forms of categorization collectively that make very little. Though there are some exceptions, of course, for some groups under the Lausanne Convention of January 23, the Greeks of Constantinople, Turks of Eastern Thrace, and some of the islands as well. But generally, these kind of very crude, large categories of, Orthodox Greeks, and Muslims of Greece, which doesn't take into, any distinction between, class, linguistic. Language, or even a geographic location as well. So yes, dealing with these groups as kind of large, identifiable, and ultimately therefore movable categories. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. By the way, speaking of the Greek-Turkish population transfer, as an example, you've described very in very clear way how it was used to normalize the other cases later on, and also because it was seen as a success. I was wondering, for people like Edvard Beneš, for instance, the Czechoslovak president who brought forward the transfer of Germans from Czechoslovakia, how much they actually really knew about the population transfer between Greece and Turkey. I'm sure they used it, but did they really know in detail what happened in the 1920s?
When you mean what happened, do you mean in terms of the experiences of those who were resettled and the difficulties involved in that? Or were they aware of the kind of the history, in as much as there was one at that point that had emerged around this, that had been written about this? Because the latter they were very aware of, and the Czech exile government studied in great detail, as much as they could, and to some extent with the assistance of the British, actually. Earlier precedents, partly in order to assuage some of the fears, that there might have been among their hosts about this quite radical measure. And they looked into as much detail as they possibly could, but they were more primarily interested in the political benefits that brought. All right. And in that sense, the big success story emerging from the Greco-Turkish exchange was, of course, Greco-Turkish reconciliation by 1930. And so there was always the caveat in any of these kind of success story narratives around the Greco-Turkish exchange that, yes, as a consequences of this, it was a tough measure, and it was very difficult for the people involved, etc. But look at Greece and Turkey, 100 years of rivalry, successive wars, regional and, you could argue, continental instability as a consequence, and now they are allies, and making a direct connection between the two of those, removing their respective minority populations and the temptation to intervene in each other's affairs, and therefore a pretext for expansion and war, and that was held up as that example. So I think there's very much a focus on the political outcomes, and that therefore this could somehow be replicated in Central Europe, perhaps, because initially this was not a Central European solution. This was a Southeast. This was for the other Europe. But to kind of bring this idea into Central Europe. But of course, it wasn't Beneš that brought this idea into Central Europe. It was Adolf Hitler. Right. Okay. With the Heimensreich transfers and agreements that Berlin signed with all of its allies between 1939 and 1941. And in that, the Greco-Turkish exchange, not so much by the Germans, but the Italians, when they signed the agreement over South Tyrol, that was invoked, saying, look, what's wrong with this? The so-called liberal democracies have engaged in this type of, interstate agreement to kind of resolve minority problems in this part of Europe, and we're just doing it here as well. So in that sense, it's not just Edvard Beneš. I mean, very much the story in the past was very much this idea of kind of, nasty Beneš introducing this idea into Central Europe. Not at all. Actually, very much so. There's a direct continuity between what happened in Southeastern Europe in 1922 and 23 and what then happens in Central Europe under Nazi and Soviet as well, of course, because they signed a number of different agreements with Berlin in 1939, 1940 in order to kind of shore up their non-aggression pact and alliance. Again, invoking this idea of, population transfers make good neighbors. Yeah, look at Greek and Turkey. Look at the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Yeah, who were, we conveniently forget, allies, essentially between 1939 and 1941. So that idea was already there in many ways, which of course made it for Beneš very easy, or much easier, to convince his British hosts and the other powers to apply this measure more extensively post Second World War to the bad minority par excellence, the Sudeten Germans. Yeah, if any minority needed to be, eliminated, it was Sudeten Germans.
It is of course interesting that, in contrast to current discussions in the public space, but also the scholarly discussions in which migration is typically a threat to the nation state, it problematizes the borders. It's an issue for welfare. It's a nightmare for citizenship. It features big in political conflicts. It just questions the very stability of the nation state in the imagination that we have. And the population transfers that you describe, in that moving people around has a completely different function. It is imagined as something which will stabilize the nation states, and perhaps, as much as we perhaps disagree with transferring people, it might have stabilized these nation states that were in some kind of process of construction. And as you spoke, I was also thinking that one set of events that could be added to this lineage are the option treaties, especially in post-Habsburg, but also post-Tsarist Russian space, in which war, large groups of population were voluntarily were allowed to resettle to their nation state across the border, and even move some property. These were also very elaborate international arrangements. But I was wondering, this notion that migration actually stabilizes the nation state is, I think, a very interesting result of your research.
Yeah, I mean, does it stabilize it? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of research has been done on Greece and the long-term impact of the resettlement of large, particularly urban populations, and the way in which that contributed to Greece's long-term economic and political instability. I don't know. I think what we should do when we're studying population transfer is to, I suppose, understand the era on its own terms. I think from the perspective of the mid-century, given what was going on, what had been experimented with, what the alternatives were, and the kind of states that had emerged from the collapse of 4 dynastic empires in East Central Europe, the notion of homogeneity, based on whether it be on language, religion, ethnicity, or a combination of all of those, seemed an attractive proposition, because of this sense that the states, or those states that had emerged from the post-World War settlement with conflicting nationalities within it, of which nationalities then became minorities, were fundamentally unstable, and that they had been the pretext for outside intervention by larger powers, and were therefore a source of not just regional, but of continental and ultimately global insecurity. And this idea, and particularly by the late 1930s, when we have this persistent notion, and you can't escape it anywhere, of the minorities problem, the problematizing of minorities, and this direct connection between minorities and war. And that is very much the case, and you see that road to war. The pretext for German intervention in both Czechoslovakia and then in Poland was that of German minorities. So there's a connection between the two of those, and to make those states viable, if they were to be recreated, then they had to be recreated in a way that avoided a lot of the problems of the interwar period. And there was minority protection there. That was one way. In the optimistic, days of 1919, they didn't, the peacemakers in Paris didn't opt for population transfer. They didn't. They opted for, largely minorities treaties as a condition for those new and expanded states being kind of recognized. And in a sense, that was an optimistic interpretation of the way in which minorities or these different groups could somehow be reconciled long-term, as non-state nationalities in these nation states. But that quickly unraveled. And minority protection, to put it in a kind of slightly kind of simplistic way, it didn't protect those minorities that needed to be protected, i.e. the Jews, and actually the Germans in South Tyrol, which didn't actually come under the minority treaties, who were terribly treated in a way that Sudeten Germans, weren't comparatively. And it largely encouraged those minorities that didn't need protection, Germans, for example, because they had a big state next to them, to undermine and to cause long-standing political problems for those states. And increasingly, I think minority protection seems to be seen as actually a threat to the state. I mean, it always was from the beginning as well. There was a sense of injustice around it, that it was only being applied to certain states, those that were kind of uncivilized. And again, this goes back to this idea of Eastern Europe, isn't it? We can actually define Eastern Europe by those states that are subject to minorities treaties, because they can't be trusted to look after their own minorities without international oversight. But more importantly, these minorities treaties were seen to be, not just an imposition on the sovereignty of the state, but also actually a threat to them, because it offered a pretext for more powerful states to intervene. So I think going back to that, when we get to the late 1930s, early 1940s, there's really no turning back. They're not going to go back to that. But what are you going to do with these minorities? They're going to still be there. Those that haven't been, exterminated, what are you going to do with them? Population transfer in many ways becomes a way of, at least for certain minority groups, those unreconcilable ones, i.e. Germans, Hungarians, to get rid of them. And I think that's very important for us to understand that there's a narrowing of those kind of alternatives at that particular point in time. If I could say one thing as well about this idea of, so it's not just about the states themselves that lose them, it's also those, I think, increasing the positive argument for it was those that were receiving them. This idea that in taking in these national elements that exist outside of the nation state borders, they could somehow were a positive contribution politically, because of course it strengthened the national claim to that land, particularly if they were settled in areas which were contested. I'm thinking here areas of northern Greece, for example, in the early 1920s, but also as well this idea that they could also be an economic asset, not just in terms of the skills that they bring, and then I go back to Greece again, this idea, but also as a spur to development. And that's certainly in terms of the success narratives around Greece and Turkey in the 20s and 30s. That's really important, and particularly in Turkey's case as well. The reception of the Muslims in Greece, which were just one of many groups that the Ottoman Empire, then Turkey, had taken in from southeastern Europe and southern Russia over the previous century, that they were helping to contribute to the Turkish nation state, which is of course the modern successor to Ottoman Turkey, its modernization and secularization. You could see that as well in retrospect in terms of narratives around German, the absorption of German expellees in the 1950s, the way that contributed to the economic wonder. Though it looks very much like that in retrospect, but certainly that is a narrative that has built up around this, that they have contributed to consolidation politically and economically of the nation state, which we see that elsewhere as well. We see it even with Czechoslovakia. 1940s, they're desperate to bring in all different elements of Czechs and Slovaks back. Even the Czechs of Vienna, or even recalling Czechs and Slovaks from America, come back, ultimately, and kind of consolidate and rebuild the nation state and make it a nation state of Czechs, and Slovaks. And we also see that with the right of return to some extent outside of Europe as well in Israel too. That's a really important part of that kind of ingathering of elements.
And thank you for the very complex answer. And one can also just travel through some of the border areas. I have on mind the border areas of the current Czech Republic to judge whether this project of expelling a large number of people and bringing in the others was so successful in terms of long-term economic development. But of course, it was part of the post-war homogenization. That is very clear. And speaking about minority protection and its broader connections, I was wondering how this is, if this can be linked to the other form of protection that started to develop in interwar Europe, and that is refugee protection, which of course includes again the figure of nascent, but also a lot of others. And I'm asking also with respect to Eastern Europe, because one thing that strikes me, one thing that actually inspired my project is this widespread perception that Eastern and Central Europe is place you escape from. It's a region visited by political crisis and authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, and economic underdevelopment and brain drain and all of that. And cases when refugees come into this region are typically described as exceptions rather than something that should be examined over the long term. So I was wondering if there's a way to connect these stories, to bring these stories together in some form, refugee protection, minority protection, population transfer?
Okay, that's another big question. I'll try and keep my answer a little bit shorter than the other one. I'm sorry. Okay, I'll start with this, not the simpler one, but maybe the one that you can also kind of help, or maybe explain as well your thoughts on this too. So this idea that, you know, Eastern Europe is primarily perceived as a space to leave. I'm not entirely convinced of that, actually. I mean, most of the displace. I mean, it depends on how we. Yeah, okay, we're going to get to the question of what do we mean by Eastern European? And I suppose I'm taking that idea of the lands between, maybe, I don't know, but in many senses, I would say that actually most of these displacements, and we should also add, they're not just displacements; they are also replacements. Yeah, as well. You know, if we're thinking of, for example, say we've got the case of the Greco-Turkish exchange, for example. People aren't going very far if you still, just it's crossing the Aegean, to kind of use the term of René Hirsch's book. But in the case of post-war Germany, the movement of Poles from Western Belarusia, Western Ukraine to to what was Eastern Germany and what becomes Western Poland. I mean, that's still within Eastern Europe. Equally, also the population exchanges in the Soviet, Polish, Slovak borderlands, between 44 and 47 as well. And those are displacements, but they're also replacements as well. Now, of course, the replacement, your example there of the Sudeten Germans in the board, very much in that military strip, there was no replacement. That was no man's land as a consequence of the Cold War. But in most cases, there was replacement, and you see that in the kind of, the revival of life and the transformation of Breslau into Wrocław, for example. So I'm not sure about whether it is necessarily a place to leave. It's a place where people are on the move. But it's not necessarily a place to leave. In terms of the connection between minority protection, refugee protection, and population transfer, one way of looking at minority protection, at least in the way that it emerged in 1919-20, when we talk of the minorities treaties, these kind of clauses inserted into the peace settlements, when the frontiers of Poland or whatever, Czechoslovakia and other new and expanded states, and Romania as well, were decided upon. One way of looking at them is actually as a safeguard against creating refugees, to prevent minorities becoming refugees, i.e. becoming stateless. And of course, when we delve deeper into why in 1919 in Paris, minority treaties were agreed upon, it's the agency, it's the activities of Jewish organizations, both from Eastern Europe and outside, who are pressing for some degree of international intervention because of the pogroms that are going on, at this particular point in time, and the fear that, if these states who have, a long history of, particularly Romania, of successive state-inspired pogroms, and of course, actually, it's in response to Romania in 1848 that we saw the first example of international minority protection. That emerges from that. This is idea that actually minority protection is there to prevent them being displaced and becoming what we would call, refugees or stateless, as understood in the interwar period. So there's a connection there, I suppose, within that. There's another connection between transfer and refugees, which I think I've probably already alluded to, in terms of the Greco-Turkish example. When I mentioned, or I suggested that we look at population transfer as a form of minority protection, i.e. removing them to a safe place. And in a sense, population transfer, if it does involve the resettlement of a group of people in a ethnic or national homeland, is in a sense a solution to refugee problem because they're no longer refugees. They belong as citizens in that state. They are no longer between states. They're no longer stuck in that crack between states. Yeah, they fit into that matrix of territory, nation, state, etc. So in that sense, population transfer can be seen as a refugee solution because it turns refugees into citizens. That doesn't change the fact that they are displaced, but they don't become these groups that exist, between states, and then become, as we saw in the interwar period, with those groups that became an international responsibility, the responsibility of a nascent international refugee regime. They become the responsibility of the nation state, which takes them in as co-nationals and co-brethren.
And in this way, of course, it's seen as a prevention of statelessness.
Absolutely,
which is seen as one of the core problems that develops in the interwar period. And what I had on mind, from my perspective, is not the lack of refugee history or some whatever kind of migration, forced migration, mass migration movements in East Central Europe, but rather the way we think about this. And what strikes me, I think there's two things. One thing that was my point of departure, it was the research about the Holocaust era refugee policies. And you had on the one hand so much very critical research about Western liberal democracies, for which obviously, at least from the perspective of this very large group of historians, excellent historians in many ways, it was essential to ask the question, why did democracies, an ethical question, why did democracies not act? Why did they not open their borders for a group that we today clearly see as refugees? And I was struck that that there are very few cases of such research for countries like even Czechoslovakia or Poland, Hungary. And that was, I think, the original point of departure for me, to try to look at what you also hinted, how we imagine Eastern Europe in quotation marks. The other question is that, of course, if you look closer, you have all kinds of research. For instance, as an example, take Czechoslovakia. You have all kinds of research about refugees, anti-Nazi refugees, Russian and Ukrainian anti-communist refugees of the 1920s, etc., etc. But in most cases, these are group histories. What is being examined is less how we accommodate, categorize these refugees, how we provide assistance, what kind of status they receive. But there's much more focus on some kind of exile studies. They're being seen as they're being understood within their group history, be it a politically or nationally defined group history. And then, of course, refugee history in the region is some kind of waiting room for these groups to return. And this is in contrast to the population movements who belong to the nation, these kind of mass movements that you were describing. And my sense is that because these large-scale transfers or even ethnic cleansings became so defining for how we see the history of this region. And again, we can come back to the 1990s and the Yugoslav wars, which influenced, I think, a whole generation of historians. And that I think has an impact on how we write the history and what we prioritize. But perhaps we should move a little bit forward with our conversation. And I was wondering, in your book, you provide a very critical analysis of how governments saw population movements, what terminology they used, and not only governments, also international organizations. And I think already in the introduction, you mentioned the exclusion of voices and perspectives of those who were affected, and that as a matter of fact, this was a necessary element of of such policies.
Mm.
So I was wondering now if it would be possible to reverse the perspective, for the sake of an argument as a thought experiment, how would your book look like if you try to write it from below? And is there a way, in terms of sources, etc., is there a way to bring in the views and the agency of these refugees into the picture?
Yeah, that's a good question, and not an easy one to answer.
I'm not asking easy questions.
And maybe I'm not the best person or the best placed person to answer it. Yeah, it would certainly be a very different book, and it would tell a very different story, given the shift away from high politics, and the interconnected activities, of states, which shaped, and defined population transfer as a policy. Could it be done from below, as a pan-European history, and with any degree of coherency? I don't know. I don't know. I think it can be, and it has been successfully done on a case-by-case basis. I'd have in mind for that, I suppose, Bruce Clark's work, Twice a Stranger, on Greece and Turkey, which I think neatly weaves together the high politics and experience of displacement, and the kind of legacies of that. So I think that was a very successful way of doing it, and kind of understanding of the ways in which these decisions of state impact upon individuals' lives, and the trajectories that they take. I might dodge the question by answering it differently, and just to maybe to latch onto this idea of bringing in the views and agency of refugees. I mean, to some extent, the views and agency of the displaced, or at least a select elite group of them, they were actually reflected in discussions around population in the mid-century, and I cover some of them in the book. And I'm referring here, I suppose, primarily to the input the Jewish emigres from Eastern Europe, mainly US-based, had on researching, writing, and in some cases proselytizing for mass population transfer during World War II. And this was often, though not exclusively, with an eye on the prospects for the establishment of a Jewish state post-war. There's also the case of the so-called democratic Sudeten German exiles, clustered around Wenzel Jaksch, who featured very prominently, probably, I'd say in my opinion, a little bit too prominently in both German and Czech accounts of the steps taken towards expelling ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia, and their efforts, these Sudeten German exiles, most of whom were in London, their attempts, which were largely unsuccessful, to kind of win over British and American opinion to alternatives to population transfer. I'd also say as well, if you want to start thinking about who are the displaced, who are the refugees, what kind of agency do they have? With reference to population transfer and the story of population transfer in mid-century Europe, I mean, it's worth pointing out that most of the high political discussion on population transfer during World War II, at least among Allied nations, took place off the edge of the continent, in exile, among displaced politicians in London. And they were, to all intents and purposes, well, refugees. Right? I mean, Edward Beneš himself, if you already mentioned there, Michal, before his long march back to, legitimacy and power, he was the quintessential refugee, living in reduced circumstances in a kind of, unpresupposing little house in southwest London, powerless, largely ignored, at least in the first stages of the war. But, he went on to be instrumental in selling the idea of population transfer to the great powers at the time and other European exiles, both as a measure for Czechoslovakia and for Europe as a whole. And I don't know if that's not an example of refugee agency, and then what is, I suppose,
Very interesting. one would also be tempted to try to seek for evidence of refugee agency of those who are less prominent. But perhaps I should add that I've recently tried to look at the studies about refugees into Czechoslovakia, written by historians mostly. And fascinated by is that you can divide almost all of them into two types of narrative, which I started to call scripts. One is the script of political refugees. This is a smaller, mostly elite group. It's a group which produces its own image in many ways. It's focused on its political or national project, and these people are captured as having agency. Mm. And then there are the other refugees who are people who are victims of more population movements, be it Sudeten German refugees after the Munich Agreement, or for instance, the refugees from the Ukraine and Belarus who flood Slovakia after in 1944 and beyond. And of course, we could add, and First World War refugees in the Habsburg monarchy as well. And these are typically and the kind of narrative that is developed around this is based much more on statistics, on categorization, development of state knowledge to manage a population, and their agency is lost. And I was really, it was striking to me that almost everything fell relatively clearly in one of these two categories. Yeah. And of course, I thought perhaps it also influences how we think about refugees today, and that would be interesting also to hear from the perspective of your research that was more focused on the mass transfers.
I think that's a really interesting point there, Michal, and a really helpful distinction to draw there. Is that, you know, these elite select few displaced, you know, they are refugees, but essentially they're dealt with partly because, as you say, they have a voice, yeah, and that voice is often expressed through their access, however limited, to, you know, decision makers, yeah, but also, you know, the fact that they might have a journal, a newspaper, a way of kind of expressing, yeah, their individual or even collective thoughts and opinions. In a sense, they no longer become refugees; they become émigrés. They become exiles, yeah, and that brings with it some form of kind of elevated status, yeah, and in which they are deserved to be heard, yeah, because of that. Whereas this kind of refugee label, to some extent, as you say, as expressed in a statistic, yeah, becomes undifferentiated, yeah, and de-individualized. So yeah, I think that's a useful way of thinking about the way in which certain stories, yeah, and certain narratives get captured and recorded, and others actually get lost. And our responsibility of historians then to go out, you know, and, you know, not just to go to, you know, Edvard Beneš's memoirs, which we can all easily get, yeah, because it's been there very easily packaged for us for posterity, but also to kind of look and to kind of discover kind of alternative ways of finding those refugee voices, yeah. And do you have suggestions for that, Michal? How do we do that? I suppose, how do we uncover those voices?
That is not an easy task, but just to give an example, there's a very interesting approach how you reconstruct refugee agency based on letters, applications that they write to, say, refugee organizations, NGOs, or to the state, kind of writing upwards. There's been a very inspiring article about this by Peter Gatrell and other authors recently, and other studies in this direction. It is a very difficult type of source, but it gives you access to individuals who didn't leave memoirs, who are of no interest as individuals with agency, or who were of no interest to the state or to the NGOs at the time. And of course, this is methodologically very difficult because this is written material, such as appeals against expulsion, appeals that relate to citizenship, appeals for assistance. It is of course a material that in which the refugees are always in conversation with the state, and they draw a certain picture of themselves, and it's a discourse of loyalty is always there. But on the other hand, reading them critically and comparing them, reading them next to each other, I think can be really enriching. So just as one possibility of where to search for. Other than this, of course, it's very complicated. I once was trying to search the large archives of oral history interviews for the Holocaust for Jewish refugees in the First World War. Because a lot of these people who were interviewed in the 1990s had this experience, but there are very few such interviews, and the sections are very short. There's not much you can find there. But let's move a little bit forward. I was just thinking whether you, if we can think of influence of these histories on how refugees are discussed today in Eastern Europe. Of course, Eastern Europe is not always a friendly region for refugees today. The anti-refugee campaigns might have been stronger. Populist politics around migration might be worse than in other parts of Europe. So I was just wondering if the history of population transfers influences thinking about refugees. So for instance, if I should give an example, whether population transfer as a movement of people which is actually organized cannot feed into these ideas of great replacement, the conspiracy theories around migration.
Okay, another really big big question. Yes, probably it does. So the reaction to the so-called migrant crisis and its aftermath is probably says as much about where European states and societies see themselves in the future, now and in the future, than it does about the past. No, and I think what's striking about the reaction at a state and societal level, and they're not always in tandem, to the migrant crisis, is that it's been able to be presented as, or can be presented as, a Western and Eastern European response, you know, in the sense of the very negative tropes around Eastern Europe, this idea that it's somehow, you know, backward, atavistic, illiberal, etc. Now, what's of course interesting in the current climate in East Central Europe is that to some extent that's been embraced as a badge of honor, yeah, by some of the populist regimes, you know, to differentiate themselves against the kind of liberal, the liberal West. And in a sense, the response, again, at a state level, at least to the recent so-called migrant crisis, is very much a kind of litmus test, yeah, of how, well, of what part of Europe, you know, states belong to. And you could argue from the UK context, it no longer belongs to Europe at all in that respect. So I think that's interesting as well, that kind of East-West divide. And of course, that's much starker, I suppose, because of at least the initial response of Merkel's Germany, you know, with the open door policy and the so-called welcome culture that we saw briefly, that has been rowed back on in 2015-16, which, and more broadly, Germany's final ascent to the kind of role of, you know, global flag bearer for liberal democracy, and that's created kind of stark contrast, I think, between the response of states like Poland, Czech Republic, or Czechia, sorry, now as we should call it, and Hungary. So there's that contrast there. The extent to which population transfers, as opposed to, I mean, displacement more broadly, and the experience of encountering refugees, and having a history of that, whether that in any way influenced the response, at a state and societal level post 2015. I think there's some claims. You can see that Germany's relatively generous response, is somehow explained by its long history, of taking in refugees and migrants, expellees in the 40s, refugees from GDR in the 50s, guest workers in the 60s, former Bosnians and late resettlers in the 1990s. I don't know. I think that's superficially convincing, because, and it's difficult to substantiate, especially as the welcome that those groups received at the time was far from warm, even towards so-called co-ethnic, brethren, expellees in the 40s, or refugees from GDR in the 1950s. So it's not as if it's a kind of unalloyed success, success story. I don't know how those connections can be made. I think they tend to be rather, as I say, kind of superficial, and I don't know what evidence there is of them. I don't know. And what are your thoughts on that, Michal?
I'm not certain, but because on the one hand, in research, but also in popular awareness, it seems in post-communist Europe, it seems like the current history of refugees started in 1989. And I think it would be important for us to reestablish these connections and the longer patterns of how we think about refugees. And I think it's more research is needed. And for me as a historian, looking at current debate, I see clear structural similarities. Every large refugee group looks like the first one, and as a big threat, and there are obvious similarities, especially less to possible solutions or approaches to refugees, but rather similarities in terms of reactions, in terms of anti-refugee discourses. And I think it all shows that the topic that we discussed today is of much concern, I think, to current scholarly but also popular debate. And we could talk for hours about it, but we don't have that much time. So I was wondering, before we finish, if you could guide us to other resources. What should we look at? What should we read about this fascinating topic?
Okay, well, I'm not going to recommend you a book or an article. That would be too obvious, and you probably already read too many of them already. So here's a suggestion. I can't read out a URL, but we can post it up afterwards, I think. So type in Documentation Center Berlin in the search engine, and this will bring up the website of the new Documentation Center for Flight, Expulsion and Reconciliation, which is just opened in Berlin. It was opened by Merkel, I think, on the 21st of June, just south of Potsdamer Platz. And the Documentation Center, and I quote from it, aims to provide information about the causes, dimensions, and consequences of displacement, expulsion, and forced migration in 20th century Europe and beyond. The main focus is on the displacement and expulsion of Germans at the end of the Second World War, which was initiated by Germany. It offers exhibitions, a library, testimony, archive tours, and workshops, events, a shop, and a restaurant. So this documentation center, and you'll find out very quickly about it when you read it, is the result of what was now almost a 2-decade-long tussle about how to commemorate and represent the expulsion of Germans in post-unification Germany. And it can trace its origins way back, actually, to a proposal by the main German expellee organization in the early 2000s for a center against expulsions. And this caused a controversy not only within Germany, but beyond in Poland. Anyway, this is a federally funded, federally mandated institution. I suppose what's interesting about it from a historian's perspective, and this is something that our listeners can judge when they look at it, Historians on this topic, of forced displacement, have often pointed out, and I point you to Pertti Ahonen's article on this in Contemporary European History a couple of years back, on the paradox about how, although forced displacement was a transnational phenomenon, it's nevertheless largely been understood and written about as a national story. And to some extent, the Documentation Center is an effort to overcome this, or to resolve this, and tell it as a European, to tell the expulsion of the Germans as a European and even global story, and of shared individual experiences. And that goes back to your question about how to write it from below. And there's an attempt to do that in some of the exhibits that they have there. Now, whether this is successful, it's probably too early to say, and you can be the best judge of that by going to have a look at it, either virtually or in person when you can travel. But I do think it's interesting, the opening of this museum in June 2021. It's interesting demonstrating the extent to which, I suppose, the framing and discussion of what we've been talking about today has moved on or not. And if only in a German context, though it has been an international collaboration to this point in time in the second decade of the 21st century.
Thank you for pointing this out, and I'm looking forward to see this controversial project, its result in person. I think it is probably my role to recommend for reading your wonderful book, Making Minorities History. And with that, Matthew, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Michal. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.